Hi there, and thank you for being here this morning. I really appreciate it. I'm Dianne Dredge, and I'm the founder and director of the Tourism Colab. And we are a social enterprise based in Brisbane, Australia, and where our social mission is really to change the way that we are delivering, planning, and developing tourism. So, yeah, thank you for having me. It's a really special connection that I have with Ontario, actually. I did my master's degree in Waterloo in Toronto, and I lived in Toronto and Etobicoke for 5 years after that. So whether it's Temagami or the Bruce, yeah, Ontario has a special connection for me. And I'm really hoping that you get some thought provocation out of my presentation today. So let's get into it. I wanted to talk today about regenerative tourism. There's been a lot of questions around regenerative tourism and how we actually do it. The point is that we don't need more justification around why we need to change and do things differently in tourism. We actually need to understand a little bit more about how to get into it and how to do it, and to really develop those skills and feel empowered that we can start to make these changes in tourism. So what I'd like to do in this presentation today is really just talk a little bit about the lessons that we can draw from the pandemic. I'd like to talk a little bit about the shifts that we've seen occurring. And because I work at a global level, these shifts I've been recognizing, and we've been doing some research in Europe and in North America and in Australia. So I'd like to share with you some of those insights. I'd also like to share with you the model that we're using in terms of building, imagining a regenerative future in tourism. And then the final thing is that I'd like to actually talk a little bit about the way that we are really leaning in to emerging practice, and to really co-design and collaborate with all sorts of local communities to build better tourism. So during the pandemic, things really started to change. And some of us who are really tapped into kind of thinking about what are these changes have been thinking deeply about this. And other people who really just haven't had time, who have really been quite, you know, at the front end, have really been struggling to kind of really understand what's going on. So I wanted to share my insights around this. There's been a plethora of research that showed that empathy has really, you know, exploded. We've really started to understand. We've had a lot more time to think about it. And there's been this rise in empathy, whether it's looking after your family, your loved ones, your neighbors. This sense of seeing the world through somebody else's eyes has really exploded as a kind of human development over the last 18 months to 2 years. And what that's meant is that, you know, people are taking more care and responsibility. We're thinking a lot more about the local. So the global and all of the tourism development that we were talking about in terms of growing mass markets and all the rest of it, we started to really turn local. So global went local. Purpose started to emerge. And there's a number of reports from, say, Kinsey and Deloitte and those kind of firms who are suggesting that purpose has really emerged, and that large corporations who don't see this switch will be left behind. So what we're trying to do is really identify a corporation or a business's purpose, and that their business model in the future should actually be pivoting and consolidating the delivery of that purpose, whether it's a social purpose, an environmental purpose, or a cultural purpose, something like that. Another shift that we really noticed is the connections that we started to really focus on as well. Not just human connections, but if we were in lockdown, it was that connection with nature that we were also missing. So we started to really tone up our feelings around who we were connected to and what we needed to be connected with. And the final shift, I think, that probably has gone under acknowledged is that we're thinking a lot more about how we're thinking. We've been thinking that the system has to change in tourism, but thinking about how we're thinking and understanding those blocks and those blind spots and the blinkers that we wear, I think there's been a lot more attention given to really understanding why innovation and why new ways of thinking have been blocked. So I really think that it's important that we acknowledge these shifts, because if we can't acknowledge these shifts, then we can't move forward. What we saw in the Tourism Colab over the last 18 months was three main types of reactions. And you might have seen these because these have been relatively well reported. So the first reaction to the pandemic was basically bounce back. We have to bounce back. The second one was, well, let's wait and see. We've got a little bit of time to wait and see, and let's think about what's going to happen here. Let's not jump and be reactive too quickly. And the third kind of reaction was about leaning in. So what is this change? And what is happening here? Is the system broken, and do we need to change it? So that, people will jump between one or another of these reactions. It's not sort of so clean cut and so distinctive which category you fall into. But it's really important to identify these, because then we can kind of acknowledge where we're sitting at the moment. Now, the bounce back narrative is all around really a triggering of fear. We don't have any solutions. We have to bounce back because there's a fear and there's a great deal of risk involved if we don't bounce back into the way that we're doing things. The second reaction, wait and see, was pretty much a freeze. We can't decide what to do right now, so let's just freeze and hold, stay in a holding pattern for now. And the third one was all about pushing back. And this is leaning in and pushing back all of that fear and all of that uncertainty and going, okay, this is the opportunity to innovation, creativity. Our thinking has slowed down. We're connecting more. We've actually got connections with different people that we may not have known. Zoom, love it or hate it, has actually brought us to a greater sense of connection in many respects. And so if you actually look at these three types of reaction, and now I'm no neuroscientist here, but these are actually a response to fear and uncertainty and anxiety. On one end, the fear is, your brain is being flooded with this cortisol, and you have to bounce back and you have to fight and get back there. On the other end, if you really are leaning in and opening and creating a generative space in your brain and your heart and your gut, you can kind of start to learn and see what might be in the future. So you're really trying to overcome the fear and the anxiousness that often closes our brain down, and we're moving over into a much more generative and creative space. So, during the pandemic, we saw all of these reactions. In the Tourism Colab, what we found is that by talking to a variety of our stakeholders, and the other thing that I've been doing is I've been running online courses to do with regenerative tourism for a range of people working in DMOs, in local government, in policy at state and federal levels, as well as in the industry. And I found that in those courses, we do a lot of talking about what is this emerging model. So this emerging model that I'm presenting to you is really where we're leaning into with a little bit of creativity and with a little bit of, a lot of commitment to a collaboration and co-design. So in this model, this is pretty much our guiding star. In this model, what we're doing is we're being guided by four key dimensions. The first is that it's place-based. There's very special qualities of local places that make tourism what it is. It's what drives people to visit a place. But that place also has values. The community has values, and it has a vision for the future. It also has relationships. It has relationships with nature, and it has relationships within the community, and those hosts and those guests have relationships as well. So it's about caring for those relationships. And the fourth dimension at the bottom is that we're caring for capital. And when I say capital, I mean all the kinds of capital that allow us to live and enjoy a sense of well-being. So that's natural capital, human social capital, cultural capital, the political capital that enables us to really collaborate and share and be open to others. It's about the built capital and the infrastructure and the tourism resources and infrastructure that we have. And it's obviously also about the financial and business capital. So if we're balancing the place, the relationships, the capitals, and the values, we're really going to start to develop a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of respect for others, whether you're a host or a local, and even nature. We need to learn to respect nature a great deal more. And that's when we can have really authentic tourism experiences and an authentic relationship between local residents and visitors. So what has this emerging model really shifted us from? It shifted us from this idea that, you know, we've always been focused on how might we grow tourism. That's been the central concern that we've been focused on when we've been planning and undertaking destination management. So how might we grow tourism? But we've shifted from that question to this one. How might we use tourism to regenerate community and nature? So you can see we flipped it on its head. Instead of pursuing growth for the sake of growth and for the sake of profit and jobs, wherever those benefits fall, instead we want to use tourism to actually help regenerate our community and nature. And when I say community, I mean all kinds of communities, business communities, local communities, special interest communities. So the point is, by really starting to develop this new way of thinking and the model that we're using to conceptualize how to do destination management, we cannot change the future using the same tools that created these problems in the first place. It just makes good business sense. I could quote probably a number of European philosophers who said this, but really, at the end of the day, it makes just good business sense. It makes good, intuitive sense. We can't change the future using the same tools that we've created, well, the same tools that have created these problems. So we do need new tools. We do need new concepts and ways of thinking about how to manage and how to frame tourism. So where we've been working in the Tourism Colab is in this space of emerging practice. And emerging practice really helps us understand what are our blinkers and our blind spots by lifting ourselves up, by zooming out and trying to understand how we're thinking, using a little bit of neuroscience. So understanding that our reaction to fear and anxiousness is really a kind of a fight or flight decision that we're making. So if we can really look into how we're reacting and how we're perceiving the threats and the uncertainty, are we opening up to the opportunities that are presented by uncertainty, or are we closing down as a result of fear? And neuroscience tells us that we're actually going to be more creative and innovative if we can lean into that emerging space rather than, double down on the messages and the approaches and the tools of the past. There's also been this real sense of creativity being unleashed in this process. And we're really trying to understand conversational intelligence. So because there's been so many people who've come to this tourism space with all of this risk and anxiety and this uncertainty, never before have we ever had so much emphasis or need to emphasize the conversational intelligence that we need to move forward. And that means that we need to think in complexity. So really understanding all of the different, because tourism has really been operating in a silo. So how is it connected to land use planning and housing policy and environmental policy and all sorts of other policy and spheres of action? So that's where we're really trying to sort of unleash some of our creativity. And in our co-design workshops and things like that, it's really about trying to channel some of those understandings. But, you know, we're not alone in this, because what we've seen from the World Economic Forum is that the skills of tomorrow are going to be different from the skills that we've traditionally thought about that we need in tourism. So all those skills around marketing and scientific management and all these things are sort of giving way to these other kinds of skills that we need in critical thinking, problem solving, active learning. So never giving up learning. You know, it's not like we learn something and we know how to put it into practice and we never learn again. It's about actively learning from every experience and every challenge and every issue that comes along. It's about building resilience and building stress tolerance up as well. So the World Economic Forum says that they're the top 5 skills that we will need tomorrow. And I think anybody who's been working in tourism over the last 2 years really knows that those skills, you know, they can actually be very draining. They can require a lot of attention to really managing in yourself. But by the same token, I think that most people in this audience today are really that's going to resonate with them about that transition over to these. So where we're working over there on the left-hand side and the skills of tomorrow, I think, you know, we're pretty closely aligned with that. And so these are the skills that we need to develop in our workplaces, whether we're working in business, in destination management, or in policy. So this brings us to this whole rise at the moment in regenerative tourism. There is no shortage of, you know, information. There's blogs, there's lots of information out there about what is regenerative tourism. Most of it remains at a fairly conceptual level. And we do have a couple of destinations who've been toying with this idea and trying to put it into practice. But we really haven't seen any real articulation of what this process is. And that's what we're really trying to work on in some of the destinations that we're working in. So what is regenerative tourism? I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but rather talking about how we're flipping the way that we normally do tourism to actually show you how we're doing it. But what is it? Regeneration is to regenerate, to renew, to enable our resources to continue to flourish in an ongoing way into the future. So it is about making sure that our capacity to continue to enjoy well-being and health and live in healthy environments, that needs to be protected. In simple terms, it's about leaving behind more than you take. And it's also about drawing lessons from nature, something that we haven't been doing in tourism very much, and we need to get really more aware of, is the notion or the practice of biomimicry. So nature can actually tell us a heck of a lot about how we can design systems, complex systems, so that they can be regenerative and continue to help us flourish. So what can nature tell us? It's a lot more complex than I'm going to just explain right now, but I just wanted to sort of give you some principles to think about. Nature tells us to reduce redundancy, to recycle, to reuse, to regenerate, to not waste so much. And so, you know, nature is really telling us this, and this rise of circular economy is really helping to reinforce this. So in tourism, we're going to need to engage a lot more in circular economy. It's not as simple as just getting rid of single-use plastics, but really how do we recycle, reuse, and really reduce the amount of natural resources and human resources, all the capitals that we rely upon. How do we actually make sure that they're used appropriately? And what I mean by that, it's about optimizing the use of resources. Traditionally, what we tend to do is to maximize the use of resources. How can we use the environment and how can we use the community to be able to generate tourism demand? But if we were to optimize those resources, we would be choosing not to exploit them, and we would be choosing to optimize so that they can actually regenerate rather than leave more than we take from those resources. The third is around information. So if we're all connected, if humans and nature are connected, we run off information and we realize that, well, if someone or something in the system is being depleted or is not coping, then we take care of that. So it is about really understanding those informational links. In nature, we know that trees speak to each other and communicate through the soil. And they've actually noticed that the edges of forests work differently to the core inner parts of forests, just because the information is actually being shared about the availability of water or soils or what's happening on those edges. So there's a lot of information that's actually being shared within forests that we just don't even really understand very much about. But imagine if we could actually take that principle and work on it in tourism. It's about mutual benefit for all, mutual benefit for nature and mutual benefit for local communities, visitors, and industry. So it's really about getting that balance and what we call a multi-facing approach to tourism. So instead of just taking that industry-led approach and the investment-led approach, it really is about benefit for all. Form and function are also incredibly important in nature. So it's the form that enables something to function. So if we apply this actually to a destination, it's how we organize the service components and the attractions and how they all function together. So we can actually take these designs and these learnings from nature and think much more about the relationship between form and function in nature. And the final thing is that it's locally responsive. And I think this is one of the key aspects that we've learned in tourism over the last couple of years, is that we can't have a healthy global tourism industry unless we have healthy local communities. So looking after our local communities and being locally responsible and responsive is essential. So there's been a lot of work done in closing supply chains and really working at that local level. So regenerative tourism, how do we do it? It's actually look, to put it really simply, it's place-based, it's community-centered, it's community-led and environment-centered. 3 key principles. So where we've traditionally talked about, it's traditionally been talked about in terms of, being investment-led and industry-led. But if we bring it back and we actually also take an inclusive view of what community is, we can really implement in a very easy way. So this is where I come into this kind of second approach. When we're really working with local communities, it's a very simple approach. We need to design out all of the negative impacts that are exploitative and that are not allowing our communities and nature to regenerate. We need to design in all the positive benefits that allow the nourishing of communities and place. And then we also need to change mindsets. And I started out this presentation by talking a little bit about how our mindsets are shifting. And so we need to spend a little bit more time thinking about how we're actually going to articulate and capture that and actually make sure that we don't lose the momentum that we've got so far. As we move out of COVID and we start to get more mobile yet again, really, how far do we want to, go back to the old way, and how much can we actually consolidate that mindset and change the system that we've all been calling for? So the final thing that I'd like to leave you with today is a little bit of an idea of some of the work that I'm doing on a very small island between Tasmania and the Australian mainland. It's in a place called Bass Strait. It's an island called Flinders Island. And this is the way we've really started to work with this community to flip all of this thinking and to think differently about how tourism happens. It is a small island that has really suffered the effects of COVID. First, there was no tourists, and then there was a lot of tourists because it was so far away. So managing that fluctuation and the impacts that it's had on the local community have been paramount in the work that we've been doing here. So it all started with the story of place. Instead of starting with a strategy and this question about how to grow tourism, what we started with is the story of what was important to the community. So remember that the guiding star that I presented earlier? We took that and we actually started to work with the community and ask them about their values, about their relationships, their connections, the kinds of capitals that they wanted to protect and preserve, and what was appropriate change and what was not appropriate change. This little piece of text that I've got here, a little bit too much perhaps to read at the moment, but it's the last sentence that really captured my imagination. It's a story, it's on the Island Away, which is the website that's slowly an emerging process of actually revealing how we're going to unleash regenerative tourism on this island. But it says, as the world chases growth, we chase meaning. It's an island that has a dark history. It's a rich environment. Its biodiversity is high, and the anxiousness of the people is very high as well. So what they're doing is, in their tourism industry, they want to chase meaning, not growth. And how are they doing that? So instead of, as I said, starting with that question about how are we going to grow tourism, we're starting with, what is your story and what are your authentic values? We can only build authentic tourism if we know what your values are and your community is really engaged in this process. We started with the community launch. Now, that's never a thing, right? Launches usually happen at the end of a project, but what we wanted to do was celebrate the community and their input and get them to own it. So celebrating their resources, their ingenuity, their creativity, their innovation is a starting place for all of the industry and the community to get together and really own this process. The third thing that we're doing is we're actually identifying projects and initiatives where tourism can be used to implement community initiatives and nature initiatives. So anything from recycling initiatives to composting that can be used to grow local fruit and vegetables for the restaurants and for tourism operators. We're really trying to sort of flip how we think about those projects. So instead of going out and going, where can we put more experiences? Where can we put more infrastructure? It's about really closing the gaps. How can we have a sustainable regenerative community? So how can we have a sustainable tourism industry if we don't have that sustainable community to begin with? So through this process, we're telling stories, lots of stories about these projects, these initiatives, about the values of the local community and their stories as well. So really developing that rich DNA of what's actually happening in that local community. And the final thing is that we're really trying to build a legacy around learning, experimenting and teaching the community about really leaning into the challenges and not being afraid to actually roll up their arms and roll up their sleeves and really get into the process. And it's a great project that's only really in its early stages. And I invite you to follow on in the islandaway.co, which is our website, because this really is a very emergent practice.